containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece, and Africa as the birthplace.
What if the biggest contradictions in the Bible, the ones that have just absolutely baffled scholars and frustrated readers for centuries, what if they aren't actually mistakes at all?
Oh, yeah. It completely reframes the entire debate. I mean, when you stop looking at a text for historical facts and start, looking at it as an astronomical allegory, the errors suddenly become the actual instructions.
That is just such a massive paradigm shift, and that's exactly our mission for this deep dive today. If you've ever sat in, I don't know, a church pew or a history class and just felt like you were losing your mind because the timelines simply don't add up, this is absolutely for you.
Yeah, it's a common feeling.
Definitely. So we are looking at a presentation today by Dr. Robert M. Price. It's called The Biggest Bible Contradictions Scholars Can't Reconcile. And Dr. Price, he does this incredibly forensic takedown of the biblical text. He's specifically looking at the order of creation in Genesis, the conflicting eyewitness accounts of the empty tomb, and that famous theological brawl between Paul and James over faith versus works.
Right, and Dr. Price approaches these texts by just highlighting the absolute irreconcilable issues that pop up when you read the Bible as a record of literal historical events.
Right, like actual journalism.
Exactly, yeah. He rightly points out that, relying on this miracle-based supernaturalism to just wave away the text's inconsistencies, it just doesn't hold up to basic logic. If you treat the text like an X-ray of literal history, the bones are clearly shattered.
The bones are shattered. I like that. But our goal today isn't just to agree that the bones are broken, right? We are going to run Dr. Price's claims through a completely different diagnostic machine, I guess you could say.
We are.
We're applying the really rigorous, comprehensive framework of the 19th century Egyptologist Gerald Massey. We're drawing heavily from his massive works, things like Ancient Egypt, Light of the World, and the Natural Genesis.
Yeah, and Massey makes a claim that is, frankly, just startling. I mean, he argues that the ancient Egyptians didn't even have a religion in the way we understand that word today.
Right, which is wild to think about.
It is. He argues their system was fundamentally scientific. It was this vast, intricate system of astronomical, mythological, and eschatological observation. So according to Massey, the Bible is not a book of literal world history.
Okay.
It's a symbolic work that preserved this ancient Egyptian wisdom, but in a transformed and, critically, a heavily misunderstood Jewish and Christian form.
Hold on, though. I really want to push back on that immediately. Because are we saying the biblical authors just, clumsily copied an Egyptian astronomy textbook, crossed out the Egyptian names, and just wrote in their own? Because that sounds a bit too simple for thousands of years of cultural evolution.
Oh yeah, no, it is much more complex than simple plagiarism. Massey's framework suggests that these biblical contradictions exist precisely because later readers and redactors, they took a highly evolved system of cosmic and natural representation, what Massey calls sign language, and they literally interpreted it as objective history.
Sign language, okay.
Yeah, so to resolve the contradictions Dr. Price points out, we have to learn to read that original language. We have to understand the psychology of early humanity before we can understand their texts.
Okay, so let's get into the actual mechanics of this sign language, because to understand why Genesis contradicts itself, we really have to understand how these original myths were even constructed. I think we tend to think that primitive humans looked at the sun or a violent storm and just imagined a giant invisible human being up in the clouds throwing lightning bolts. Like, we assume they imposed the human image onto nature.
Right, which is the standard assumption of modern anthropology, right?
Yeah.
Anthropomorphism. But Massey vehemently denies this. He points out that primitive humans in Africa were just far too helpless against the terrifying, overwhelming forces of nature to think of those elemental powers as human.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, they didn't have the mastery over nature to, arrogantly project their own image onto it. The primary representation of nature powers was entirely pre-anthropomorphic.
So they didn't see a human face in the storm. They saw a force that was inherently superhuman, something they just couldn't control or reason with.
Exactly. And to express these superhuman forces, they developed a vocabulary using what Massey calls zoo types.
Zoo types.
Yeah. They looked at the living animals around them that possessed powers far beyond human capability, and they used those animals as ideographic signs.
I see.
So think about the force of the wind. To early humans, the wind wasn't a man blowing with puffed out cheeks. The breathing force of the air was conceptualized as shu, and its zoo type was the panting lion.
Oh, wow.
Right. The lion was a fitting, terrifying figure for the roaring, panting power of the hot wind.
Or like the concept of the Earth Mother giving birth to life. I remember Massey notes, she wasn't initially imaged as a human woman. She was apt, and she was represented by a pregnant water cow, or like a hippopotamus.
Yeah, Apt the water cow.
And the soul of life in the waters was Sebek, the crocodile. Although I want to be very clear here for the listener, Massey isn't saying they literally worshipped hippos and crocodiles.
Oh, no, no, no. That is a massive misconception that even classical Roman historians fell for. It's not animal worship, it's a visual alphabet.
Right.
When later writers mock the Egyptians for, worshiping long-tailed apes, they completely missed the point. The ape, or cynocephalus, was the saluter of the dawn in their mythology.
Oh, it was a symbol.
Yes, it represented the worshiper of the light, not the object of worship itself. This fundamental misunderstanding, mistaking the symbol for the literal truth, is the root of the entire problem. And it brings us to how they applied this zoo-type language to the stars, which Massey calls uranography.
Okay, let's define that, because I think that's the key that unlocks the first major contradiction Dr. Price brings up. We normally think of Genesis as cosmography, right? An attempt to explain the physical creation of matter out of nothing, the forming of dirt and oceans and all that.
Right. But Massey argues the ancients weren't writing cosmography at all. They were writing uranography. Uranography is the mapping of the constellations. It's the charting of the firmament and the recording of these massive cycles of time in the spheres. They were tracing the movements of celestial bodies and describing them using their established language of zoo types.
So mistaking ancient uranography for literal history, it's kind of like finding a map of the London Underground, looking at the colored lines and the strange intersecting stations, and genuinely believing it's a literal anatomical diagram of a giant, multicolored subterranean monster living beneath the city.
That is a perfect analogy. If you read a subway map as anatomy, you're going to find endless biological contradictions. A blue artery intersecting with a red vein at a sharp 90-degree angle makes absolutely no sense biologically. But it makes perfect sense systemically, as a map. Dr. Price is looking at the biblical text and correctly pointing out that the biological historical anatomy makes absolutely no sense.
Because it's a map.
Right. Massey is saying that's because it was always a star map.
Okay, let's apply that map directly to the first page of the Bible then. Dr. Price points out this massive collision between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2.
Oh yeah, the creation account.
Yeah. In chapter 1, we get the very orderly, priestly account. God creates the plants, then the animals, and finally, as this grand finale, creates Adam, or humanity.
Right.
But then you flip the page to chapter 2, and the timeline completely inverts. Adam is created first, and then God seems to, experiment. He realizes Adam is lonely, so he creates the animals to see what might fit as a companion. So Dr. Price asks the logical question here. Did God not know what was coming next?
Exactly.
Why create animals as an afterthought experiment if you already had a master plan in chapter 1?
And if we demand that Genesis is a chronological account of the physical universe being built, well, Dr. Price's critique is just devastating. It is a blatant contradiction. But applying Massey's lens, the Genesis creation is actually the fragmented remains of Egyptian astronomical myth. The beginning is not the start of the physical universe. It is the beginning of timekeeping and celestial observation.
Okay, walk us through how Massey maps the opening lines of Genesis back to Egypt. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep.
Right, so in Massey's reading of the Egyptian wisdom, the beginning starts in the domain of Sut.
Sut.
Sut, yeah, S-U-T, which represents darkness and the unorganized abyss. The deep, or the firmamental water, is the Egyptian Nun, or Nu. It's the celestial ocean of space. Then we have the line, the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters.
Yeah, that's a famous one.
In the Egyptian mythos, this is Shu, that breathing force or wind we mentioned earlier, and his twin sister Tefnut, who represents moisture. They are the elemental powers that physically separate Nut, the heaven, from Seb, the earth.
So the creation story is actually describing the lifting of the firmament, the conceptual separation of the sky from the ground, which is just the foundational act of setting up a theater so ancient astronomers could chart the stars.
Yes, exactly. The setting is a celestial theater. It's not a physical planet forming, which totally explains the contradictions regarding the animals and the man. According to Massey, in these ancient origins, the beasts that were created were actually constellations whose figures were like animals.
The zoo types.
Yes, they are the sign to the zodiac and the surrounding decans. So God creating the beasts is just the mythological encoding of ancient astronomers charting the constellations.
Okay, which brings us to the creation of Adam. If the beasts are constellations, what is the man? Because this is where the timeline really breaks down in the literal text, right?
Well, the creation of man is not the molding of the first biological human out of mud.
Right.
It is the astronomical creation of Adam in the zodiac. And Massey connects this directly to the precession of the equinoxes.
Oh, the precession. Let's do a really quick ELI 5 on the precession for the listener, because it's a massive concept and kind of hard to visualize.
Good idea.
So the Earth essentially has a slight wobble on its axis as it spins, kind of like a slowing top. And because of that wobble, the background of stars we see during the spring equinox slowly shifts over thousands of years. It takes about, 26,000 years to complete one full cycle through all 12 zodiac signs?
Exactly. And ancient astronomers were acutely aware of this massive cycle. They tracked it. The vernal equinox moves slowly backward through the signs. Massey points out that thousands of years ago, the equinox moved from the sign of the lion into the sign of the man.
The man.
Yeah, represented in some traditions as Heracles or in Egypt as Adam. So the creation of man in this context is the establishment of a new astronomical age, the age of Adam, or Adam.
Wow. This completely reframes the contradiction. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 aren't competing historical timelines written by confused authors who couldn't get their stories straight.
No, not at all. They are two different exoteric allegorical representations of celestial charting and natural cycles.
Oh, I see.
One tradition focuses on the order in which the constellations were mapped, or how the elemental powers were divided, while the other focuses on the later transition into the zodiacal age of the man. The contradiction only exists if you demand a literal historical timeline from a text that was originally designed as an astronomical allegory.
It's like taking two different cultural myths about how the North Star got its position, printing them back to back in a modern astronomy textbook, and getting angry that the math doesn't add up.
That is the colossal blunder Massey speaks of.
Yeah.
The Semitic theologians, when adapting this older African and Egyptian material, they literalized the legends. They turned the mythical abyss, which was the Mother Earth and the firmamental water, into a literal physical ocean. They turned the elemental powers into literal days of the week. They basically forced a cosmic cycle into a historical box.
But the danger of literalism doesn't stop with the Old Testament, obviously. If charting the stars gets literalized into a botched history of the Earth, what happens when we move forward in time to the New Testament? Because turning spiritual myth into literal history has even more profound consequences when we hit Dr. Price's second major contradiction.
Oh, definitely.
The historical Jesus and the accounts of the empty tomb.
This is perhaps the most critical juncture in both Dr. Price's assessment and Massey's framework. The transition from a solar myth to a flesh and blood historical figure.
Right, so let's lay out Dr. Price's claim here. He highlights the irreconcilable differences in the four gospel accounts of the resurrection. And the core question for a historian is really simple. Did the women see Jesus at the tomb or not?
A simple yes or no.
Exactly. And Mark, which is the earliest gospel, says the women go to the tomb, they see a young man in white, and they flee in absolute terror, saying nothing to anyone. They do not see Jesus.
Right.
But then Matthew tells a completely different story. Jesus suddenly meets them on the road and greets them.
Yeah.
John says a whole group arrives, sees nothing, but Mary Magdalene stays behind alone, and she sees him, though initially mistaking him for the gardener. And then Luke says they don't see him at all, a point that is reiterated later by the disciples on the road to Emmaus.
And Dr. Price argues that this completely vitiates the entire event as historical evidence. I mean, if four witnesses in the courtroom can't agree on whether the primary subject was even at the scene, the testimony is thrown out.
Right, it's perjury or just totally unreliable.
As a matter of historical forensics, Price's argument is airtight. The accounts contradict each other fundamentally on the basic facts of the event.
But Massey invites us to look at the Egyptian origins of the Christ myth.
He does.
He argues that the Jesus of the Gospels is the historicized version of Eusa, the ever-coming Messianic son, and Adam Horus.
Massey proposes that the narrative we have in the Gospels is not a biography of a first-century Judean rabbi. It is a fragmented reproduction of the Egyptian mythos. Just look at the cast of characters.
Okay, let's look at them.
The earthly father, Joseph, correlates to Seb.
Seb, who is the earth god.
Yes, the Egyptian god of the earth, who is the father on earth of the Messiah's son. The mother, Mary, correlates to Mary, which is an Egyptian name for heaven, or Nut. Seb and Mary afford the two mythic originals for Joseph and Mary.
Oh, wow. Which naturally leads to the resurrection, because if the birth and the parents are mythological, what is the empty tomb in this context?
In the Egyptian system, the resurrection of Horus is an eschatological and solar myth. It's not a historical event happening in a physical tomb over a 3-day weekend. It's the solar god rising from Amenta, the netherworld, the realm of the dead, and ascending the Mount of Glory. It represents both the daily return of the sun, conquering the darkness, and the resurrection of the human soul into eternal life.
Okay, I have to stop you there for a second. Is Massey seriously suggesting that the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were sitting around in a candlelit room in the 1st century, secretly reading the Egyptian Book of the Dead and conspiring to write a fake history? Because that conspiracy theory sounds pretty far-fetched.
Oh no, Massey isn't suggesting a deliberate deceptive conspiracy by the gospel writers. He's describing a massive process of cultural diffusion over centuries. We really need to distinguish between the esoteric and the exoteric here.
Okay, let's clarify those terms for the listener. Esoteric meaning the hidden inner spiritual truth understood by the initiates, and exoteric meaning the outward, literal story sold to the masses.
Exactly. The Egyptian ritual of the resurrection was esoteric. But over centuries, as these ideas migrated into Hellenistic, Jewish, and eventually Roman cultures, the inner meaning, the gnosis, was lost to the wider public.
It just faded out.
Yeah. What remained were the exoteric husks. The stories, the rituals, stripped of their cosmic context. The gospel writers, according to Massey, inherited the leavings of primitive or archaic man.
The leavings.
Yeah, they took a sublime, multi-layered ritual and tried to force it into a mundane historical narrative set in Roman-occupied Judea.
Which explains the absolute chaos at the empty tomb. Why do the 4 Gospels completely disagree on who was there and what they saw?
Because they are drawing from different fragments of that older myth. In the Egyptian mythos, the resurrection of the solar god is attended by the 2 divine sisters, Isis and Nephthys, or sometimes by the 7 Hathors, who are represented by 7 Marys.
Wait, really? Massey actually points out there are 7 different Marys mentioned across the 4 Gospels, right?
Yes. He links them directly to the 7 Hathors who attend the birth and resurrection in the Egyptian texts. When you try to historicize a cosmic allegory, the narrative breaks. You are trying to squeeze a massive cycle of the sun and the spiritual journey of the soul into a literal physical rock tomb in Jerusalem.
It's not gonna fit.
No, it's not. The Gospels contradict each other because they are not eyewitness accounts of a historical event. They are different literary attempts to historicize various fragments of a ritual. Dr. Price identifies the historical failure of the texts. Massey explains why they fail. They were never history.
It's like finding a scattered deck of tarot cards, having 4 different people pick up a handful of cards and asking them to write a historical news report about a guy named the Fool. They're all going to tell wildly different contradictory stories because they're trying to turn symbolic archetypes into a police blotter.
That is the tragedy of reading a myth as history. And this colossal blunder, turning spiritual myth into literal history, it doesn't just mess up timelines and tomb accounts, it fundamentally fractures human psychology and theology.
Which is the perfect pivot to Dr. Price's 3rd major contradiction. Because if you convince people that the resurrection was a literal event in a literal tomb, you suddenly change the rules of human salvation. It's no longer about an internal spiritual journey. It's about believing in a historical event.
Exactly.
And that massive shift causes a theological bottleneck that scholars have fought over for 2 millennia. The conflict between Paul and James regarding faith versus works.
This is where the loss of the original Egyptian gnosis has its most devastating real-world impact.
Yeah, let's look at Price's claim on this. Paul writes in his letters that justification, being made right with God, is by faith alone. He explicitly uses Abraham as his textbook case, arguing that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness long before any laws or works were established.
Right.
But then you have the Epistle of James. James calls anyone who believes in faith alone a shallow man.
Yeah, he doesn't mince words.
Not at all. James insists that justification is by works. And ironically, he also uses Abraham as his proof, pointing to Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac as the physical work that justified him. Dr. Price says you simply cannot reconcile this. It's a flat contradiction at the very bedrock of Christian theology.
And on a literal doctrinal level, Price is absolutely correct. I mean, the two texts make opposing claims. But Massey's explication traces this fracture back to the destruction of the unified Egyptian eschatology. In the original Egyptian framework, the Christ wasn't a single historical man named Jesus who died to pay a debt.
Okay, so what was it?
The Christ, or Horus, was an ideal divine principle working within every single human heart.
Wow.
It was the potential for divinity and eternal life that every person carried.
So how did this inner principle get split into a war between faith and works?
We have to look at the journey of the soul in Amenta, the Egyptian netherworld. When a person died, their soul didn't just get a free pass to paradise based on a single belief. The journey through Amenta was a rigorous process, famously depicted in the weighing of the heart ceremony.
Right, the scene where Anubis weighs the deceased person's heart against the feather of Ma'at.
Yes, representing truth and cosmic balance. To successfully navigate Amenta and reach the Mount of Glory, the soul required two things. First, it required a deep understanding of natural law and a record of moral action in life, which we can call works.
Okay.
Second, it required an alignment with the divine light, a profound trust in the ultimate reality, which we can call faith or spiritual truth.
Right, it's like trying to start a fire in the wilderness. Works is the physical effort, gathering the wood, creating the friction, striking the flint. But faith is the oxygen. You can't just pick one and expect a flame. If you just have wood and friction in a vacuum, nothing burns. If you just have oxygen with no fuel, nothing burns. You need both mechanisms working together to create the light.
That is a much better way to understand it, actually. In the original Egyptian eschatology, it was a unified, holistic system. But when the literalists took over, they lost the inner gnosis. By translating symbolic fluid wisdom into rigid, literal dogmas, they shattered the unified myth. Because they no longer understood the holistic spiritual journey of the soul in Amenta, they began arguing over the empty husks of the tradition.
So one theological faction grabs the husk of faith and builds a rigid doctrine around it, totally ignoring the rest. And another faction grabs the husk of works and builds their own competing doctrine.
Precisely. So Paul and James aren't just two early church leaders having a polite disagreement. They represent the splintering of an ancient unified philosophy into literalized factions. They are fighting over the pieces of a broken mirror, each claiming their shard is the whole reflection.
By turning a universal symbol for the soul into the biography of one historical man, the literalists created a system where you had to believe in the objective historical reality of that one man's actions to be saved. The profound internal spiritual requirement was essentially replaced by a requirement for historical credulity.
And Massey notes a really powerful Talmudic warning on this. He quotes, "Whoever translates a verse in its closely exact form is a liar."
That's intense.
It is. The moment you lock fluid, cosmic myth into rigid historical literalism, you kill the truth of it. The theology fractures because the foundation it was built on, the historical reality of the myth, is fundamentally false.
Wow. Let's pull all of this together because we've taken a really deep dive into Dr. Price's contradictions. We looked at the creation order, the empty tomb, the clash of faith and works, and we've run them all through Gerald Massey's Egyptian framework. And I think it's fair to say Dr. Price is entirely correct in his forensic analysis.
Oh, absolutely.
The literal text of the Bible is full of historical, logical, and theological contradictions that just cannot be reconciled on their own terms.
But according to Massey, Price's literalist framework, which ironically he shares with fundamentalist believers, completely misses the ultimate point.
Right.
The fundamentalists say it's all literal history and we just have to have faith to resolve the contradictions. The secular scholars, like Price, say it's meant to be literal history and the contradictions prove it's false history.
And Massey steps in and says, you are both wrong about what the text actually is.
Exactly. Massey's central thesis is that the Bible is a symbolic work. It preserves ancient Egyptian allegorical, astronomical, and eschatological wisdom. The contradictions exist because sublime myth was literalized into grotesque history.
It's the tragedy of reading a poem as a police report.
Yeah.
You lose the true meaning and you're just left arguing over nonsense.
Well said.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. If we stop demanding that these ancient texts act as flawless history books or science textbooks, we might actually recover something much more profound. If the story of the Christ was originally meant to be a universal symbol for the divine potential in every human being,
it shifts the responsibility of salvation from a historical event back into the human heart.
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.